this segment, I want to discuss federalism. Having discussed separation of powers and checks and balances, and emphasizing that they were designed to act as limits on governmental power, I want to talk about another very different kind of limit, that of federalism. Federalism is a dry subject, and most people want to pass over it quickly, but I want to spend some time emphasizing what is unique and special about federalism, because there's a sense in which federalism is America's greatest contribution to governance around the globe. It seems strange, but I want to emphasize, constitutions were not brand new in 1789. There weren't very many of them, but there were constitutional governments in Austria-Hungary, in Switzerland, and without having a written document, there was constitutional government in Great Britain. Nor was democracy brand new. It could be traced all the way back to Athenian democracy. It could be traced to the Roman Republic. Not brand new, not frequent, but still not brand new. But what is brand new is federalism. And federalism is brand new because we put together democracy, the rule of law, constitutionalism in a package, and that made federalism possible. Why? Well, up until 1789, around the globe, there were an almost undiminished row of sovereign governments. They were all sovereign governments in which sovereignty was in the hands of an individual, called a king, an emperor, or whatever. This sovereign could not be divided, or so it was thought. This sovereign could not be divided because it was embodied in a person. There was a rule of person, or a rule of king, or a rule of power. There was not the rule of law. The concept that a sovereign had to be an individual person meant that sovereignty could not be divided. Now, sovereignty could be limited in some ways. If sovereigns got together and wanted to compromise, they could create what was called a confederation, which was essentially a combination of unitary governments. A whole bunch of unitary governments decided they would cooperate for the greater good and would sign a treaty between the individual unitary governments, creating some new confederation. And there were confederations that existed prior to 1789. But there wasn't federalism, because federalism is an attempt to split sovereignty into packages and give sovereignty to different levels. This was made possible because the decision had been made prior to 1789, indeed I think prior to the American Revolution, that the rule of law had to be followed and embodied in the Constitution. Well, why is this important? Well, if I may, I'm going to quote from a famous pamphlet before the American Revolution, written by Thomas Paine. It was called Common Sense, and at the time it was the best-selling pamphlet in the colonies. It really made the case for independence from Great Britain, and while independence had been discussed before, nobody had put all of the arguments in a single package. It was probably Thomas Paine's greatest contribution. Now, there's a line in there that was so significant that it was taken out of Common Sense and put in the opening line of a very famous book on constitutional law by Edward Corwin, called The Higher Law Background of American Constitutional Law. And this is the quote. It's in paraphrase, but here it is. The Reformation superseded an infallible pope with an infallible Bible. The American Revolution replaced the sway of a king with that of a document. And Corwin supported his point by quoting Thomas Paine. But where, some say, is the King of America? Let a crown be placed upon the law, by which the world may know that insofar as we approve of monarchy, that in America law is king. I've already discussed the rule of law as putting a standard higher than the government. So President, Supreme Court, senators, all these people are all responsive to the law. They have to take an oath embedded in the Constitution itself that says they swear to uphold the Constitution. All right, now what has happened here? Well, now law has been made sovereign, not an individual person. We have the rule of law, not a rule of person. And when you have the rule of law as the sovereign, you can divide sovereignty. Now it's no longer taking an arm and a leg off a king. It's a question of putting into writing what powers will be gone to each level. So in the American system, certain powers are granted to the national government and certain powers are granted to the subnational or subunit governments, which we call or identify as states. How are these, and all of those rules are set out in the Constitution itself. The Constitution, the rule of law creates the Constitution creates the possibility of federalism. And this was unique. This division was highly important. And I have to emphasize that it was spread around the globe. If we look around the globe today, where there were no federal governments prior to 1789, we now have a whole host of them. We have the Federal Republic of Germany. We have Canadian government, which is divided into provinces which have their own authority. The Federal Republic of Nigeria. When the Saddam Hussein regime fell in Iraq, and it was discovered that there were big splits between Kurds and Shiites and Sunnis, things that have not been resolved to this day. The only solution that was conceivable was a federal solution. So federalism has in fact spread quite widely around the globe. And even countries that had no intention of allowing individual action or action by the subunits, countries like the Soviet Union or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is what Stalin ruled with an iron fist, claimed to follow the Federalist pattern because it made extraordinary good sense. Why was this important for America? Well, if we took a sort of a popular look at American history was all a great bunch of friendly folks who got together on the east coast of the North American continent and formed a new nation and had a jolly good time and loved one another the whole time. But we know that's not true. Now, extensive research, particularly in recent years, has shown that there were massive cultural differences between North and South, between East and West, and even within the central parts of the East Coast, big divisions. David Hackett Fisher, in his book Albion Seat, lays out at great length 4 major divisions that came from Great Britain. Some of them were political opponents of one another. The Puritans of Massachusetts and the Cavaliers of Virginia came from absolutely opposite sides of the English Civil War. So we had massive differences. More recent research by Colin Woodard in his book American Nations makes it clear that there were not 4, but perhaps as many as 11 different cultural systems operating in the United States. Well, how are you going to operate with 11 different cultural systems? The only way to do it is to unite the country as a whole, but then allow autonomy for local areas. And you can do this in practice. The British have done it. The British have largely allowed different cultural systems to prevail inside of what they now call the United Kingdom. You can do it informally, and you can get along with it. But a better way to attempt to do it is to do it in writing through a constitution that sets out the rules for federalism. I can't cover all of them in this short segment, so I'm just going to outline them right now. And I'll be open to discussion when we get to class about the differences between them. But let me set out what the powers are and where they're located in the Constitution. First of all, the concept of the Constitution is that the people, we the people, in the opening words of the Constitution, we the people established a federal government, a national government, which would have authority over foreign affairs, authority over critical issues dividing the states, but would leave autonomy in the hands of the states. The powers of this national government were delegated to the national government by the Constitution, and they were set out. So they were enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Because they were enumerated, you could say they were express powers. And so the delegated or enumerated or express powers are found in Article 1, Section 8. And incidentally, Article 1 deals with the powers of Congress. And that's where we find the critical powers of the national government. The framers of our Constitution thought Congress, not the President, not the Supreme Court, Congress would be the most important of the three branches in our system. Okay, Article 1, Section 8 has the delegated, enumerated, and expressed powers. But where are the powers of the state? The powers of the states are not expressed in the body of the original Constitution, because those who framed it in the summer of 1787 thought that it was crystal clear that they were merely creating a new federal government and it would only have the delegated powers in Article 1, Section 8, which were quite specific. That Congress had the power to lay and conduct taxes, to declare war, that sort of thing. They thought it was unnecessary to say that all the rest of the powers belonged to the states or to the people. But after the document was drafted in 1787, it went to the states for ratification. And at that point, various groups in various states, more than one state, objected that there was no Bill of Rights, that there was no statement of the individual rights that they hoped to protect. And there was also no statement that the states' rights would be protected. So they insisted that a Bill of Rights be drafted. And among the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment was specific that all powers not delegated to the national government are reserved to the states or the people respectively. And that, by the way, is a paraphrase. But that's the essence of it. Amendment number 10 gives the unexpressed, unenumerated, undelegated, reserved, or residual powers to the states. But within the body of the Constitution as it exists today, where every word has the full force of law, there is now a protection for the states. You may say, and there's a lot of political discourse in this country that says, states are weaker today in comparison to the federal government than they were in 1789, and that's true. But it is not true to say that the states have no reserved powers. And indeed, much of what we observe around the country in terms of the experimentation done by states is often extremely valuable. And some of it means that those states can offer a counterpoise to the people within their states against the powers of the national government. Federalism is not dead, though it is true that the power of the states has been reduced over time. In addition to the power, these two powers, which are the delegated and the reserved powers, there's a third category of powers. They're called the implied powers. The implied powers are based on language in the Constitution, but it's somewhat less clear. They rely on Article 1, Section 8, the very last paragraph. Article 1, Section 8 starts with the words, Congress shall have power to. And then it lists lay and collect taxes, declare war, and so on. But the last one says to take all steps necessary and proper to carry into effect the foregoing powers. The advocates of applied powers have always said that this meant that the federal government could do things that were necessary and also things that were appropriate or proper to carry into effect the foregoing powers. Now, one of the principles of the rule of law is that laws should be as clear as possible, that they should not be vague. Well, this is one of the sections of the Constitution that simply could not be written specifically. They couldn't say explicitly what additional powers might be necessary. And indeed, constitutions, unlike statutes, have to have more leeway for their operation. So it required a period of about 30 years to resolve this question. Only with the case of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819 did the issue of what were the implied powers, what were the necessary and proper powers all about. In effect, the Supreme Court declared that if the federal government was acting within its proper sphere, it had the authority it needed to have to carry into effect the foregoing powers. This was a victory for the advocates of the federal government against the states, and it was the most powerful state. If you want to talk about what weakened the states, it didn't happen under Lyndon Johnson. It didn't happen under Barack Obama. It happened in 1819. Now, those implied powers have expanded considerably, but they've expanded considerably not just because of the 1819 decision, but because of shifts in the definition of what general welfare means, and shifts in what it means to say that there's commerce between the states. There was once thought possible to make a distinction between interstate and intrastate commerce, but that's no longer possible.